Hello and welcome to the YMyHealth podcast. My name is Julie Woon and I am your co-host for today. And we are joined by Alex McNulty. She is the founder of McNulty Wellness Collective and a therapist who created the collective as a space for people to explore sustainable whole person wellness. Alex helps individuals connect with practical tools and supportive practices that foster long-term health, balance, and resilience. And today we have her on the podcast to discuss the connection between nutrition and mental health. So, welcome to the Why My Health podcast, Alex.
Hi, Julie. Thank you for that wonderful and lovely introduction. Thanks for having me.
You're so welcome. We're really excited to have you on. I think this is a topic that a lot of people are interested in, and you're seeing more and more discussion around it. But before we get started, could you just start by giving us a little bit of background on yourself and McNulty Wellness Collective?
Yeah, sure. So I just celebrated 3 years in private practice. Prior to this, I was at Johns Hopkins for about 5 years. I left to go out on my own and practice a little bit more my way, a little less medical model focused, more holistically. I specialize in anxiety disorders, OCD. I'm currently working towards my perinatal certification, partially inspired by the fact that we just welcomed a baby girl 9 weeks ago. So
Yes.
please forgive me if I have some postpartum brain today. But it's been an exciting summer. We also hired our first therapist to expand the services we're providing for women through perinatal and reproductive women's health. This kind of supports our whole body focus. Obviously, reproductive health is such an essential component when it comes to women and their mental health. And I have a special interest in nutrition because I've seen firsthand how it affects, our mental health. And I don't think mental health treatment is really complete without looking at the whole body.
Absolutely. And congrats both on family and business expansion. It's so
Thank
exciting.
you. Yeah, it's been a fun, eventful, sleepless summer.
Yeah. Very, very fair. And you touched on this just a little bit now. But what inspired you to integrate wellness and mental health into your practice?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think initially when I was in grad school, I had the challenging experience of helping my mom navigate a metastatic breast cancer diagnosis for about 5 years. None of her providers gave her any information about nutrition, but she actually took it upon herself to make some nutritional changes. And she wasn't focused on weight. She wasn't focused on appearance, like changes to nutrition typically are. She wasn't focused on fighting the cancer, but really just kind of, an additional way of supporting her well being through going through something hard. And interestingly, despite the chaos and the disruption that her diagnosis caused, in many ways, I had never seen her feel more empowered. Really just from, making those changes and having a sense of self-efficacy through, the way that she chose to eat and nourish herself. So at a time when so much was beyond her control, she was actually able to control a few things and nourish herself in a way that other things couldn't. It helped her mood, and that was incredibly inspiring to me. So, really since then, I've seen a lot of inspiration from my clients. I've seen what incredible change can take place when people do focus a little bit more holistically. I've seen clients, take it upon themselves to just start walking around the block and, really alleviate a lot of depressive symptoms. Or I've seen clients, we've discussed eating more frequently and completely just discontinue having panic attacks after having them multiple times daily without any other intervention at that point. So it just became harder and harder to ignore the positive effects that I was seeing.
Sure. And I think that is partially why this has become such a popular topic to discuss is that people are becoming more and more open to the idea of, you know what, maybe these issues that I'm having, it's not just like a one and done solution fix. Like there are things that I should be doing in other ways.
Yeah,
Um,
and could be, right? It's,
right.
how wonderful that there are so many different angles that we could approach things.
Absolutely. And it's so personal. I think to your point, you're talking through
Mhm.
these different examples and these different people.
Yeah.
Um, in, I guess, the simplest terms that you can, how does nutrition impact our mental health?
Yeah, I mean, if we really think about it, it's hard to imagine how it wouldn't. Society's definitely bought into the idea that our mind and thoughts affect our body, like how we might lose our appetite when we're really anxious about something. But we're learning more about how the body affects the mind. So, what was once thought of being a unidirectional relationship is actually way more bidirectional than we initially thought. There's a lot of ways to really capture that. There's a lot of ways that nutrition affects our mental health, but to highlight a few, there's blood sugar regulation, neurotransmitter production, hormone regulation, nutrient deficiencies, inflammation, and of course, gut health. I'm happy to briefly get into a few of those if that would be helpful.
Yeah, I would love that. I
Okay.
think we were definitely curious about the gut health and microbiome piece of it.
Mhm. Mhm.
But all of those I think are relevant examples.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, please forgive me. I'm gonna probably nerd out, and also my dog is gonna be here to join us for the
You're
rest of
good.
this. As far as blood sugar regulation, this is something that's interesting because I don't think we typically associate blood sugar with, nutrition, or with mental health, rather. Excuse me. But I guess to summarize, our blood relies on glucose to function, and so if there are strong spikes and crashes in this, that could be caused by like prolonged periods of not eating, eating simple carbs, sugars, and other things. Our brain will prioritize regulating itself really quickly. And it'll do so through the release of stress hormones such as cortisol and epinephrine, which is also adrenaline. Obviously, we've heard of that. And this can come at the expense of our mental health. So, this is a lot of what's behind being hangry. And that's definitely a real thing. It's not just something that we're making up. I think a lot of people, when we really think about it, experience that. The mood swings of a hangover, which I call anxiety. We even see that with, kids experiencing mood changes when they eat a lot of sugar. I know I see that with my toddler. So blood sugar regulation is not just related to diabetes, but it actually can play a significant role when it comes to our mental health because of the release of those stress hormones. As far as neurotransmitters and hormones, basically everything that we eat gets broken down and serves specific roles, and they can either support our mental health or at times work against it. So, of course, we're all familiar with serotonin, dopamine. They're created from amino acids that are found in protein. So, of course, we want to have nutritional sources of those proteins. As we know, I think it's becoming kind of more popular mainstream. 95% of the body's serotonin is produced in the gut. But it is important to note that the gut derived serotonin, it does not cross the blood brain barrier. So it's not exactly the same as the serotonin used in our brain, which is kind of an oversimplification. But because of that gut brain axis that you were just referencing, it can play a major role in our mood.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think I've definitely seen it in myself, right? Like getting
Mhm.
hungry and getting more irritated more
Yeah,
easily for sure. And
absolutely.
so it absolutely makes sense. Um, are there particular foods or dietary patterns that support mental wellness?
There's not, one size fits all, of course, but I would say in general, there are some recommendations that couldn't hurt, for lack of a better word. And they definitely can be associated with better mental health. So I would say, as far as addressing blood sugar, focusing on eating frequently to kind of avoid those prolonged periods without eating, to avoid those kind of major spikes in blood sugar. I would also encourage a focus on foods to add. So avoiding what we call like naked carbs, essentially just when it comes to blood sugar, carbs provide kind of like really quick energy. It's like gives us a quick boost, but then it fades quickly. Fats and proteins are more like if carbs are kindling on a fire, fats and proteins are kind of like those like slow burning logs. So in order to kind of avoid spikes in blood sugar, pairing a carb with fats and proteins can be really helpful. So that would be like adding nut butter or cheese instead of just having crackers, stuff like that. So a lot of focusing on what to add rather than to take away can be very helpful. Eating fiber essentially feeds the good bacteria in our gut. So that's whole grains, fruits, vegetables. A lot of the traditional advice rings true when eating your fruits and veggies really is as good as they say. Eating in a relaxed state. So, being in a parasympathetic state, essentially kind of the opposite of the flight and fight sympathetic nervous state, there is the parasympathetic nervous state, which is rest and digest. So, if we are in a parasympathetic, more relaxed state, our digestive system's able to work a little bit more properly. This could even look like just taking a few diaphragmatic breaths before eating. You don't have to, be in a total state of zen, but just feeling a little bit more calm. And then I guess eating the rainbow would be helpful as well. Trying to diversify your diet. Phytonutrients are the things in foods that give them their vibrant color. So sometimes I try to incorporate as many colors in what I'm eating as possible. And a lot of the things I just described are also kind of part of the Mediterranean diet, which is why it's kind of like time and time again recommended.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense. And I think a lot of millennials or really anybody that's in the workforce, this is something that in the back of your mind, you maybe know it, but it might be harder to implement in practice as far as like,
Mhm.
rushing in between meetings to squeeze in a quick meal. You are not in a relaxed state necessarily doing that. You might have limited choices for what your meal
Mhm.
options are and what the balance is there. And so I think like it absolutely makes sense that, like, these are things to try as best you can to deal with or be prepared for rather, um, but something that I think gets a little lost in the shuffle, and then maybe you don't realize what effect that's having on you mentally as well.
Yeah, for sure. And that's why I spend a lot of time with my clients providing that psychoeducation. I don't want somebody following nutritional advice just because somebody, including myself, told them. I really spend a lot of time getting into the nitty gritty as far as this is why it's important. I think that really helps with that buy in as opposed to, as millennials, just like another rule that we're trying to follow and do the right thing.
For sure. So, when you are working with clients who are maybe struggling emotionally, how do you explore eating habits as part of, maybe their treatment or at least a discussion of what's going on with their lives?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I make a point to ask about eating habits right on my intake form. So from the jump, I want to get a sense of somebody's relationship with food. I ask if they have history of disordered eating, but even beyond that, just want to get a sense of their relationship with food and the impact it has on their life, positive, negative. Um, it's also helpful to know if clients have eating restrictions such as celiac or preferences like veganism, because this will kind of get my spidey senses tingling as far as, I don't know, certain nutrients they might not be getting. An example of this being that low vitamin B12 is associated with depression. And since it's often found in animal products, it cannot be kind of tough to get adequate amounts of it while you're vegan. So I would make a note of that. But again, it's kind of, asking that in the intake and then based on, my client's relationship with food, kind of narrowing focus from there.
Sure. Have you ever had anybody who's maybe a little resistant to talking about food or who doesn't see the connection? And how have you managed that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, food and eating habits can be a very emotionally charged subject. I think we think of like politics and religion, but I think that food and nutrition has become so contentious because of so much misinformation and shoulds. A lot of us are walking around with this kind of like personal rule book that we have, and it's created from our culture, our upbringing, and societal messages. Sometimes we don't realize how tightly we're gripping it. So I try to get a sense of what somebody's rule book says about food. And then based on that, we can shine light on it and maybe question it. In therapy, I would never focus on good or bad behaviors, but instead kind of returning to the question of why, the why behind the choices that we're making, and kind of, hey, is this working for you? And if yes, then rock on. Who am I to say that it's not working? But if no, do we want to use this space to make some changes? And that's why I try to incorporate the whole body perspective in my practice, because I want I want that to be a part of the conversation so much as my clients would.
Definitely. And I think talking about maybe some of those kind of preconceived notions or personal held beliefs around food, we see a lot, especially with social media now, where diet culture and mental health could be at odds. And how do you encourage nutritional changes without triggering any shame or guilt or that disordered eating, right? Because, like we just said, it can be triggering to talk about these subjects. So I'm curious about um, when people are just being fed this diet culture, especially via social media, what do you do?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a great question. They're certainly at odds, and because of that, I'm super careful with my words. I try never to, well, I never do hand out, right? This like sheet that people want me to give them as far as like these are the foods to eat, these are the foods to not eat, good, bad, dichotomy. But kind of like I said, I encourage a focus of why I want clients to make nutritional choices as a tool for empowerment rather than a vehicle for shame. So if somebody's making the choice to get a side salad instead of french fries because they don't want to be bad, or they, feel like they can make up for it with a intense workout later that day, that's very different than choosing a side salad over fries, because they just kind of notice that fries make them sort of depressed and irritable after they eat them. If somebody wants to get ice cream after dinner because it's been 100 degrees out and they got a new flavor that you want to try, that's very different than, oh, I've been bad all day. I might as well just ride this out. I'll make up for it tomorrow. With anything that comes from our behavior, I'm focused less on the behavior itself and more so on the why behind. Um, I actually find that helping clients adopt a different paradigm when it comes to nutritional choices can combat diet culture, because it sort of de emphasizes calories and appearance and focuses on nourishment and mental wellness. I think in our society, we've kind of lost the plot a little bit. And the most harmful way that I've seen the nutritional advice harm my clients is through promoting a lot of rigidity and kind of, you know, reinforcing the same toxic culture that we all grew up with, especially as millennials.
Yeah. I've seen so many videos online now talking about, especially with the millennial age group growing up through like the 90s, early 2000s, and how much of an emphasis there was on like celebrity weight and appearance and all of these things. And I think um, maybe that's why the conversation continues to come up with this age group is because
Mm.
that was such a prominent part of pop culture during our, kind of foundational years.
It really
Um,
was. I think it contributes to that rule book so much in a way that, I mean, we're swimming in diet culture so much that we don't even realize we're in it. And I think we all remember that photo of Jessica Simpson, and we were like, this,
yes.
everybody's like, this is the worst that a human body could possibly look.
Yeah, and she's, looking back at it now as an adult, you're like, "No, she looks so normal and healthy." It's
Yeah.
crazy that we were told that this was like, the media just demonized this for no reason.
Absolutely, and just the idea that somebody's weight and size is relevant and matters. I mean,
Yeah,
it somebody's size and the way they look is kind of often the least interesting thing about them.
for sure. Yeah. What are some accessible and realistic changes somebody could make when they're trying to support both their body and their mind?
Yeah, sure. I mean, kind of touched on this earlier, but focusing on what to add and not what to take away. Again, with diet culture, can be very restrictive. Women, particularly, are sold that idea of less is more when it comes to calories. But if we kind of shift that paradigm and focus and utilize food as a source of nutrients, we don't want to be left with nutritional gaps. So instead, kind of thinking about things that we can add. So, for
Yeah.
example, if I'm making pasta, I focus on what I can add to it. My husband and I get pizza almost every Friday because we have a newborn and a toddler, so we've nothing better to do. And it's delicious. I'm never going to really cut that out. I don't want to. I have started having kind of like a side of arugula salad or broccoli, not because I'm trying to be good or make good choices, but just because I've noticed it actually feels a little bit better on my gut. And that is just something that works for me. So, again, kind of along those lines of what to add rather than what to take away, focusing on food diversity. I really enjoy eating bowls for this reason. So just kind of having some brown rice and a protein and then adding as many different colors as possible, something that I enjoy just to kind of focus on, okay, how do I get more sources of more different things? Um, and I think a simple one, again, traditional, but don't skip breakfast. We want, smooth blood sugar, we want to start off the day with sustainable food. So I think that that's often, it's almost like we're so familiar with the advice that we kind of overlook it, especially we're super busy. I get it, but breakfast is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Another one of those things where it's just like, when it's a busy day, it just feels like an easy thing to say, okay, well, I'll just skip breakfast today. No big deal. But
Or oh,
yeah, it
yeah,
can
and
affect your whole
traditionally,
day.
right, like, I think in many ways it's kind of like, "Oh," I've seen this attitude of, "Well, I'll just skip breakfast so that I can use those calories later in the day," and it's not how it works.
Yeah. We've talked about a few different factors of why people might have these kind of like personal beliefs or preconceived notions about nutrition. I wanted to just quickly ask about socioeconomic factors as well, and potentially food insecurity, and how that could affect someone's ability to prioritize nutrition and mental health.
Yeah, for sure. Deep breath. I'm not gonna go on a rant here, but, this is just such an important question, and, it's one that our current administration conveniently likes to kind of brush over, but, food deserts do exist in our country due to a lot of economic inequality, redlining, a bunch of systemic factors, and they affect the food choices that are available to people. So, programs like SNAP have historically helped to reduce this food insecurity. Like with many things, SNAP has its issues, but we can't ignore the fact that, this is how millions of Americans rely on feeding themselves and their families. So I guess in many ways, the morality and judgment that we attach to food is really kind of absurd. We've become so accustomed to othering people when it comes to their food choices and holding people accountable to making choices without recognizing that people often have choices that are limited. We want to make America empathetic again. It's not that healthy people are making good choices. I think that people have good choices to make. So, in order to promote health and, wellness, we need food accessibility and we need to address systemic issues.
Yeah, totally. I've seen some commentary online as well about essentially the tie of like socioeconomic status and also diet culture and the ability of people to even have certain diets because they meet a certain socioeconomic status versus someone who may not and they don't have the choice and the luxury that can kind of be as well.
Mhm.
And so I think it is just so interesting to see that play between the two because I think we talk about so many things with food, and there's just another one here, and how that affects your mental health as well.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure. We view things in extremes, and it's certainly not as black and white or overly simplified as people make it out to be.
yes, absolutely. So I want to talk a little bit about, work at your practice and a lot of what we touched upon kind of earlier in the episode and what you talk about on your website too is this holistic approach to wellness. And so I wanted to see maybe in a little bit more detail right now, sort of any integrative approaches that you use or what this looks like when you're working with someone.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, holistic is one of those words that gets kind of like a weird reputation for being like woo woo or counterculture. It's really just a belief that different parts are interconnected and affect the whole. So when it comes to the human body, it's really the belief that brain, body, they all affect one another. Treating mental health simply through looking at our thoughts is, in my opinion, sometimes a very narrow way of looking at something that has so many more contributing factors and kind of like tributaries, for lack of a better word. It's kind of like if your mind is a reservoir with a bunch of rivers flowing towards it. If there's a problem in the reservoir, it would be silly to only look at one of the water sources while ignoring the others. So, in my practice, I pay attention to the foundations, right? Somebody's nutritional choices, their movement, their sleep, their lifestyle, the environment, culture, everything. And I think that, there's definitely this sense of individualism that plays a significant role. But in my years of practicing as a therapist, I'm talking so much more about these other things that are affecting how we feel simply rather than just kind of paying attention to our thoughts. It's definitely one piece of it, but it's not the full picture.
Definitely. And when you're looking at nutrition more specifically, do you collaborate with dietitians or functional medicine doctors or just really any other kind of nutrition professionals when you're working with a client?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's important to note I am not a nutritionist or a dietitian, so I will certainly, refer out if there's something beyond my wheelhouse, which there often is. Would refer to other healthcare providers for labs and specific nutrition plans. I'll even refer for pelvic floor health and working with the perinatal population. I certainly try to stay within my lane, but I think that the integrative collaborative approach is something that we all need, and it's such a disservice to our clients when we operate in these very siloed sort of ways. It'd be nice if kind of everybody's providers were able to collaborate and say, okay, these are my areas of focus. How do we all look at this person as a whole person rather than just kind of these very separate parts?
Yeah, I think this is something we touched on in other episodes of the podcast with other providers as well, is that, especially in the American healthcare system, trying to find these opportunities to collaborate and looking at the whole picture is so important, but also so hard to do sometimes.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
know some of the episodes we've done about people with chronic illness, like POTS, for example, that's one of the conversations where a lot of
Hmm.
times when they find something that works for them, it's because of this collaboration that has happened
Hmm.
across different physicians.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's obviously a lot that is not working for us with our current system. So, eventually, I don't know, we can't just rely on providers to try and figure it out within a broken system. So, yeah, there's a lot at play.
Oh, yeah. It could be its whole own episode if we really want it.
Oh, for sure.
Um, we talked a little bit about things like eating breakfast and, you talked about sleep as well a little bit. How important is routine, whether that's meals, movement, rest, in the broader picture of mental wellness?
I think a lot of this is personality specific. So, if you are someone who feels that routine benefits your mental health goals, it can be a really fantastic way to gain structure and promote discipline. So we're not always going to feel motivated to make certain choices, but discipline and routine and structure can certainly aid us in that. That being said, as with anything, we want to be careful to not go a little too far with it. So, if you start to notice that routine begins to work against your mental health and your values, such as prioritizing the routine over making values led choices and your enjoyment of life, that's when I'd probably examine my relationship to it. So I think it's kind of typical therapist answer. It really depends on what it means to you.
Totally. It still makes sense. Maybe we can talk about a little bit of advice for listeners as it relates to nutrition and mental wellness. So, are there signs that might indicate someone's mental health symptoms are related to poor nutrition that they could keep an eye out for?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'd encourage folks to just pay attention to patterns that they notice, right? So if at the end of the day, I think we kind of just like eat sometimes as a way of just, well, we have to, right? If you notice there are particular times of day where you feel more depressed or anxious, especially if they do seem to coincide with prolonged periods of not eating or certain foods, I'd pay attention to those patterns. Any GI problems, like if you notice that bloating or constipation seem to be correlated, I'd love to get into some GI stuff too, correlated with mood changes. A lot of this stuff is kind of the chicken and the egg. So our food choices can affect how we feel, and how we feel can certainly affect our food choices. It's very multifactorial, but I would mostly pay attention to patterns. And again, just that idea of that intuition and paying attention rather than kind of just going through the day without noticing.
Yeah, I think let's definitely dive into the GI issue piece because this is something that I've noticed personally is like, if I'm feeling a little anxious or I'm maybe, stressed out, that I can definitely tell there's an effect on either my level of hunger or alternatively just like my stomach being upset. That's
hmm
one of like my body cues of being anxious. And so I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, for sure. We could definitely do 1,000 episodes on this. I will try to be succinct. And as I kind of referenced earlier, I think that the psychoed behind things is really crucial when it comes to understanding how our brains and our bodies work so that we can make these choices from a place of feeling informed and empowered as opposed to just, oh, serotonin. Okay. We really want to know what's going on. And it's so complex, right? I mean, I can't believe begin to understand just the surface of it, let alone we as humans barely have been able to. Um, to kind of like briefly summarize, basically, a lot of us are familiar with our central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord, but there's also a part of our body's nervous system located along the GI tract. That's called the enteric nervous system. And the ENS contains like hundreds of millions of neurons. To be honest, I've read a bunch of research papers on this. The exact estimate is it changes in every paper I've read, but it's a lot. So, so much to the point that it's been deemed the second brain. So we definitely want to pay attention to that. The gut and the brain communicate through this nervous system. Of course, we're familiar with this. We talked about, if we feel anxious, we might get butterflies in our stomach and experience GI issues as a result of that and just kind of not feel good down there and feel a little wonky. There's a reason for that. So, when a person feels danger, the fight or flight response kicks in and the enteric nervous system will slow down or stop our digestion. This is done because, basically our body wants to use energy not for digestion, but to fight or flee away from danger. Digestion is not the priority, so when you're running from a tiger, the priority is staying alive. Unfortunately, our bodies don't know the difference between running from a tiger or getting a work email. So we experience a lot of these in modern day, even though they don't really serve the purpose that they were once designed to. Our bodies haven't caught up to the perils of, existing in 2025. But the fight or flight system is associated with sympathetic. I referenced earlier, the parasympathetic nervous system is really used for rest and digest. Both of these systems provide input from the central nervous system to the ENS and the GI tract. I know I'm getting a little bit into it, but it's important to kind of acknowledge that if we eat in an anxious state, we will often experience GI issues as a result of that because our body is just not able to process those nutrients properly. What's also interesting is that we're getting more evidence as far as how GI issues affect our brain and our mental health. So, what I mentioned earlier, what was once thought to be one way, is actually more of a two-way sort of street. So, the enteric nervous system, while it can be controlled by our brain, it also can act independently. So, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the vagus nerve. It's something that's definitely, being discussed a lot more with good reason. Through the vagus nerve, the gut receives messages from the brain, and it can also send messages back up to the brain. Actually, 80% of the messaging in the vagus nerve comes from the gut to the brain. Only 20% is from the brain to the gut. So, put very simply, having a diverse microbiome, healthy, good bacteria, will affect what is being communicated back up. So, again, we're just learning a lot more about how how what we're eating is affecting how we're feeling as opposed to just kind of brain being the power at B and controlling everything.
Yeah. No, it's an exciting time, I think, in some ways to just see how much is coming out about this and where we're
Mhm.
headed.
Yeah.
Um, because yeah, it makes sense. And I think a lot of people experience this in their personal lives.
Mhm.
Um, what's some advice you would give for somebody who maybe feels overwhelmed or doesn't know where to start with this?
I would say just pay attention to how you feel when you eat, right? Information itself can be a good, inspiration. I think that we tend to over rely on external cues when it comes to when to eat and how to eat, like these rules and these shoulds and all these other sorts of things. We've lost our way in being able to identify those internal cues, intuition, embodiment, how we're feeling. So it's a lot of unlearning. So I would say my first piece of advice would really just be to pay attention more and to kind of like drown out all of that noise. And trust me, that's not necessarily easy, but I think it's worthwhile.
For sure. I agree. Well, I want to spend a few more minutes, just a few other questions to wrap up. Maybe some like quick hits of thoughts that we've got. So, what would be one myth about nutrition and mental health that you wish people would stop believing?
That food is medicine, which might sound surprising for me to say given everything
Yeah,
I just shared, but, for its popularity, I actually hate that phrase. Food's an important piece of mental wellness, absolutely. We just discussed this for quite a bit today, but food is also culture, it's community, it's comfort. It can be all of those sorts of things, and, my concern is that if we conflate it with medicine, not only are we detracting from the importance of medicine, which plays a significant and instrumental role in our health, we also kind of inadvertently moralize the use of medicine as if it's sort of this like last resort after making poor nutritional choices. This idea is really entrenched in a lot of ableism and privilege. So it's a lot more nuanced than that. I think nutrition can be a wonderful tool for our physical and mental health, but we want to leave it at that. It's a tool and it's one of many. So, I think that the idea of food being medicine is a little oversimplified. I can appreciate and I will, support some of the messaging behind it, but I think sometimes it can overly simplify something that's a lot more complex.
sure. And if you could get everyone to make one small change to support their mental health through nutrition, what would that be?
Take your lunch break. Stop eating while reading emails. I'm guilty of this, absolutely, eating between clients. But as we talked about, eating while stressed can affect our digestion. It, affects our intuition. We're not, focused on what we're eating and nourishing ourselves in a certain way. So take your lunch break.
Yeah, definitely guilty of this as well.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, I think the last thing, Alex, is just where can listeners find you if they want to learn more about McNulty Wellness Collective?
Yeah, one of these days I won't be so social media averse, but until then, listeners can visit my website, www.mcnultywellness.com, and viewers can join my newsletter from there.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today and sharing everything. Is there anything that we didn't touch on that you want to convey as well?
I don't think so. Again, I think just kind of the idea that while this is all, I hope we talked about a lot of different things and a lot of,
Yeah,
biological terms and stuff like that. Again, just kind of emphasizing that poor nutrition can look different person to person. So, of course, for some, that can be a diet high in ultra processed foods, contributing to inflammation. Can also be a diet with a lot of nutrient deficiencies because somebody is engaged in restrictive eating or omitting entire food groups like carbs or fat. So, I really see in our culture that we equate thinness with health, and folks in thinner bodies are often met with the assumption that they are healthy, which might not be the case. Course, a lot of fat phobia runs rampant. So again, just kind of emphasizing that nutrition is a big piece of our mental health. It is certainly not the only one. And my goal is to empower clients to make choices that work for them. But I think that that requires a lot of nuance and it's never really going to be properly communicated through an Instagram post or something that we're seeing online. So I hope that more mental health therapists and other providers can adopt an integrative approach because I think that it really does often require kind of that more like nuanced understanding of where a person's coming from.
yeah, absolutely. Well, Alex, thank you again for being on.
Thank you, Julie. I appreciate it.